Alrighty, folks. Well, thank you for tuning in to another author interview with the High Fantasy Podcast. This is Morgan and Shalini on camera again, and here we are with Mr. Ja-Mel Vinson. Ja-Mel, thank you for
Hi.
coming on to the podcast.
Hi. Glad to be here today.
Yeah.
So,
No, it's great to have you as well.
yeah, I know. Like we take away the words from everybody. Yeah. We're happy to speak to another person in this time of being isolated because of COVID and whatnot. And yeah, we like to thank you for coming on. And we indeed just shared our opposite living situation in terms of geography, because you're East Coast and we are West Coast and in Canada. So
a little bit far. A little bit.
just a little
Just
bit.
a little bit.
Shalini and I we lived close to Toronto, Canada for a long time, and that's kind of like the New York of Canada.
Yeah, that's New York of Canada, but it's not really New York because nothing's New York. There's only one New York.
we can try all we want, but it's never gonna be the same,
Nothing but a pale imitation. Even though I would kill for so much stuff that Canada has, but we're not gonna get into that right now.
Yeah, no worries. Well, Ja-Mel, again, thank you for coming on. Ja-Mel, you are the author of Dreamer, a fantasy novel with sci-fi elements about the descendant of Joan of Arc who must combat demonic forces. When not reading books or his own, Ja-Mel Vinson is making lesson plans and going to class. Ja-Mel is a college sophomore majoring in adolescent English education and loves to overanalyze and deconstruct video games, books, and movies. And he lives in Brooklyn, New York with his mom and his cat, Blackie. So I just saw that word overanalyze. And I was just like, hey, familiar. That's great. Just describe a bit more about yourself, Ja-Mel, and of course about your book, Dreamer.
So, that blurb was written last year, and because it was written last year, some things have, shall we say, progressed onward. I'm a junior now, technically I'm not in college at the moment, but I'm trying to get back into college, but I was a junior when I left. I left for mental health reasons, and it's been a struggle to get back in, but we're working on it. Here's hoping we can go back for the fall, even though the thing that shall not be named is currently ravaging the world.
Yeah.
It's a strange time, for sure.
We don't have Blackie anymore because we sadly had to put it down last year. But I have a kitten, and his name is Thor. And he is...
That's my favorite superhero from the Marvel movie.
He is somewhere. I could go grab him, but I don't particularly want to because that's work. But yes, I do love to overanalyze books and movies and TV shows and everything like that. Words. I really like sort of like game theory and film theory and just like watching video essays and everything like that on YouTube, and sort of like really digging into and constructing and deconstructing things that I like read and ingest. That's part of why I started doing book reviews on my website, which I really need to get back to. My website has been pretty empty it hasn't really had much of anything in it for a while. Anything new anyway. And it just kind of stems from like everything with me really, because I've always been I think that's part of the reason that I really love like English and why it's always been my favorite thing and why I'm trying to be an English teacher.
Mm-hmm.
But partially because like, you know, books is literally books and words are in my life. But aside from that, just being able to sort of like deconstruct it and deconstruct the thing and look at it and construct a meaning from it and see how it relates to the author themselves and how they themselves have brought themselves into their story, because it always happens. It happens with every single author. Even if they don't know it or don't know how at the time, it happens, which is why I say we can't separate art from the artist, but that is a little bit outside the purview of this. But yeah, so I really love like overanalyzing and sort of like dissecting things and breaking them down and seeing what makes them and what gives it an identity and why it is the way it is. And part of that makes its way into Dreamer, which this is the cover.
Yeah.
This is the gorgeous, gorgeous cover.
Yeah.
This is Maya. This is Lucent, who you can't really see unless I move it closer.
Mm-hmm.
She's the
But
translucent.
this is Maya. This is Lucent.
That's the clone.
Right, okay.
The protagonist.
We also have a bookmark. This is random, but we have a bookmark too.
Nice.
This is reality just true.
Yeah.
There was a question later on that I wanted to ask, I guess now, because it relates to what you were talking about in analyzing books and media. How has the process been like from being a writer to coming from this like analytical mindset? Because I'm similar as well, because I'm doing a master's thesis in English, so I'm deconstructing things constantly, particularly in British poetry and things like that. So there's a lot of like things going on there. So how is it going from that to becoming a writer yourself? I imagine it's quite difficult to not overanalyze your own work. But can you take us through that process?
I just kind of roll with the overanalyzation, to be quite honest. So I write, or rather my first two books anyway, have been science fantasy, which is a combination of sci-fi and fantasy. And in Dreamer, that's very clear and very obvious, and sort of like the fact that we have a clone, which is a very popular sci-fi trope. And like we have a clone, which is a very sci-fi trope, and we have the true dreamer, which is essentially not necessarily a chosen one, but chosen one like. And this just feeds back into the charms thing, but my brain is just, I have ADHD, so my brain is just like, okay, want to go down this rabbit hole, but no, I need to force myself to stay focused because I'm on a podcast right now, and this isn't just like it is a conversation, but it's also not a conversation. It's a thing unto itself. But so like there are all these tropes and everything from sort of like both genres, whether overarching or just subgenres, and I've just worked them all into Dreamer. And also superhero stuff, because Dreamer is, Maya's essentially a superhero, essentially, just without like, you know, a secret identity, because that doesn't work for this world, because, oh goody, now we can talk about the tropes and how Dreamer completely bucks them all. So, the main question of Dreamer, the main question of Dreamer, and one of the two big relationships of the book, is between Maya and her clone, Lucent. And just to give a little background on the clone, because, and this isn't particularly a spoiler because it comes up fairly early, Maya's clone, Lucent, was made from her when she was 13 years old. And when her clone was made from her, which no one really knows how, the clone had taken Maya's powers away, which again is a very how. But the clone took Maya's powers away. And Maya hasn't had her powers for 5 years at this point, and she goes and gets them back. And when she gets them back, she finally ends up meeting the clone again meeting the clone for essentially the first time, because she wasn't able to before, because everyone was like, oh my god, this is a rogue true dreamer. She will literally kill you. We need to stop her from doing that. So whenever Lucent would try to do anything, she would just get kicked out of the universe, essentially. But so like as Maya tries to get her powers back, she ends up sort of like trying to dig deeper into the relationship between her and her clone and how they are different, if they are different. And so what do you know about like clones in popular culture and popular media? How are they portrayed, depicted? What do you think of when you think of the word clone?
Yeah, so for me, and this is an interesting question. So I typically think of Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Mm-hmm. So where they're used in like a intensely sci-fi, like setting, where it's like genetic engineering for military purposes, because the clone army is kind of like a mercenary army, I suppose. I'm sure the Star Wars fan listening will absolutely destroy me on describing them like that, but that's,
you're not wrong.
Like it's partly what, that again, it's like my take on it. And then I also recall I can't remember if I liked it or if it was just impressionable. I think I have to rewatch. It was a long time ago. But I watched Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yes.
And that is one where they totally screw with your head when it comes to like, wait, is this the real one? Oh no, there is an alternate timeline where it's the real Arnold or whatever.
The Total Recall movies are a thing.
There's something. I think the overarching thing.
Okay, so it probably wasn't that good if I can't remember anything. But
yeah, true. You can't recall?
I cannot totally recall.
Okay. I think the overarching thing about clones is that they're always antagonistic. There's this fear of the clone, like, or of AI.
Medical ethics, that kind of.
Yes.
So like, you think of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where there's this dystopia where everyone who's human has like a thing against like people who are other. That's kind of in any situation, but specifically like mechanical or.
Yeah. Now granted, like with Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, it's different because it's AI and Lucent isn't AI, she's flesh and blood. But the point is, like you were saying, that clones in popular media and virtually everything are antagonistic. And they are always, always, always evil.
Yeah.
Without fail.
I'm trying to think of one. I can't think of one where,
like, unless the character themselves has the ability to clone people, and themselves. If the clone is made by outside means, by someone who isn't the main character, who isn't the main protagonist, the clone is likely going to be evil or some sort of evil representation of them or what have you. Now with Dreamer, and I've always not gonna say I haven't always like. Well, I don't particularly like that. It doesn't have the. Forgive me if this sounds like I'm being very academic, but it doesn't really do anything. It makes the clone feel not real. And I get like, okay, like, it's a story. Everything in it is inherently not real. But, well, there has to be an element of realism to these things, unless it's surrealism, in which case it's completely counter to all of this. But the clone is always just evil for evil's sake. They're made evil. And that's kind of the question at the heart of Dreamer. Is the clone evil? What is she? What's her relation to our main character? Because for me, I've always disliked the evil clone trope because it's a question of, it always just gives me the question of why would they be evil?
Right.
Because a clone is just another version of you. We could theoretically, if we wanted to, make the argument that twins are clones of each other.
Right.
Now, granted, they're not, because one, they're aware of each other's existence, and that in and of itself fundamentally changes how they view society and how they view each other and their relation to each other and themselves. But that's essentially kind of the point of what I'm trying to get at. That if they were brought up in the exact same circumstances and then deviated at some point, which is what we could say happened with Maya and Lucent, even though they were technically the same person, then what happened? Then are they still you, or are they someone different, or what are they? Because now in Dreamer you can do a lot of things. You can do virtually anything. If you can think it, you can do it. Yeah, that's kind of the main power that Maya has. It's a very, very big power. It comes from comic books, Scarlet Witch and Franklin Richards and all of those folks.
Yeah.
So yeah, very, very high power in Dreamer. But in Dreamer, that's just kind of like a question and a thing of, that's a question that Maya herself fundamentally has. Is this clone me? She has to be me. No? Why is she evil? What makes her evil? Is she evil? If she's evil, why is she evil and I'm not? What's the difference in the degrees of separation between me and her? So that's just kind of how I sort of like broken down and deconstructed the trope of the evil clone, because it's just always bugged me that there's no real question of the clone being evil. It's just accepted as a fact. And granted, there is some validity to having a clone just be blanket plain evil. And I do also do that in, not Dreamer, but in something else. But even then, even with the question that they're undisputedly evil, there's something larger at work here than just, okay, evil clone, we need to kill the evil.
Yeah, this is bringing up a lot of things that I've studied in my own English degree as well, because I just did a course on Frankenstein this past January to spring kind of semester.
It felt like a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've been in quarantine forever, guys.
Yeah. Yeah, and like the last half of it was just online, just talking about Frankenstein. But I might be wrong, but I feel like Frankenstein, well, it's considered one of the first modern science fiction books.
Mary Shelley.
Yes, Mary Shelley, amazing. she's kind of a hero. So, but in that story, it's not a clone, but it's something that's created from like a mad scientist. And that creature, I think Mary Shelley is trying to point out that there is like nurture versus nature kind of question going on for everything. So the creature is born innocent, but then because people treat him badly, he becomes evil, essentially. And that's kind of what we were deconstructing in the course. So it's really interesting to see how like that trope of like a created human being that's other has been translated into clones, but the social reality of how they became that way, like how they became othered and socially ostracized, and then becoming like, an evil being has kind of been erased in, I think, the process of history, starting from Mary Shelley. So it's interesting that you're bringing back like the social commentary of, how does one become quote unquote evil, or someone who does, message from Zoom.
Just completely interrupted it. The social commentary about like how does evil come about, and is
essentially is evil born or is it made?
Exactly. Yeah. So no, it's really cool that you tackle that in another sci-fi book, kind of an iteration of Frankenstein in a way.
If I might add too, I think as like this kind of topic is tackled a ton in fantasy and sci-fi, like the origin of evil, or like is it inherent, etc. Is it inherent in some other type of species or fantasy races, etc. But I think with clones, it becomes, I think by design, a bit more of a personal conversation, because you consider, if I had a clone, would my clone be evil? Or what does that have to say about like all the questions that you just mentioned? So yeah, I think it's pretty cool that it is kind of circling back, but I think it's like, I don't know, I guess a fresh take, but it's also a take that it's always kind of been there. It's just, I think we've undervalued it, like you said. Like it's just not considered that important of a dialogue, or people want to represent it in ways that are a lot more external and about, the world is just chaotic, and then that's how evil is created or something. And it doesn't really talk a lot about personal agency or personal choices or that kind of stuff. There's a lot more, like there's a lot of thoughts now that I'm having too that I'm kind of struggling to articulate. But it's such a big topic for sure.
Yeah, I think we can segue into another interesting part of Dreamer, which is the lore behind Maya's magic, which is that she is a descendant of Joan of Arc. So there's like fantasy elements, sci-fi, and then a bit of like historical stuff going on in your books. So I just wanted to ask, what inspired you to center the lore of your protagonist's powers on Joan of Arc particularly?
I've always been a fan of alternate history. I don't particularly know why. Granted, my actual just enjoyment of history itself leads into that, but I've just always been a fan of alternate history, and another YouTube channel that I listen to, that I watch, is Alternate History Hub, which sort of explores what would happen if these things in history that happened in our timeline didn't happen in another timeline. Like what if the Confederacy never lost? What if Grand Columbia actually stayed alive? What if the Nazis had won World War II? Because that has to be a fundamental question that's asked every 25 years. And with Joan, there wasn't particular. Okay, with Joan of Arc, honestly, I don't really think there was a reason I chose her other than she was just major. She's just been a major female icon, and honestly, her life was incredible. And there's also so much that either don't know about her or that is still shrouded in mystery and is still shrouded in myth. Granted, in Dreamer, I don't dig into it too much. Joan is like I don't dig into it too much, but one of the major deviations is, well, I mean, you could find this out in Dreamer, is that Maya is a descendant of Joan of Arc, a woman who, in our timeline, died when she was 29, I believe, and who was childless. So, with Dreamer, the way that I did Joan and the way that I took Joan and made her is, she is, and granted, some of this is stuff that we don't really find out in the book, but this is just stuff that I've had in my head for quite a while, is that she had her parents. She was a dreamer. She's the same species as Maya, which, also another thing, just random aside, we have multiple species in Dreamer, and there is no hidden magical world, because I hate that trope, because it just makes no logistical sense. It really, really doesn't. It really doesn't, because, again, like, you are hiding yourself from the world. It's only going to get harder with time to do that. 2, well, 3, kids are eventually gonna, like, reveal it, because kids reveal all. What happens when someone breaks the rules, which are invariably gonna be broken? Do you even have something to deal with that? It just doesn't make sense. To me, it just doesn't make sense to sort of like have a hidden magical world for my own personal stuff, even if I do sort of like read and sometimes enjoy that stuff. To me, in my stories, it just doesn't make sense, especially from a sort of like world building standpoint, because you're just doing double duty at that point. You're just doing double work, as opposed to just creating a world that is uniquely its own. Like Dreamer takes a lot from our world. It's a modern, futuristic-ish world in Dreamer. A lot of sort of like the major architectural stuff and everything looks the same in our world, but there are differences just peppered in throughout. Most of them are kind of like outside the purview of Maya's sort of like world, because Maya's campus is supposed to be an oasis from it all. But there is some of it in there. That comes in the next position. But anyway, back to Joan. The reason I brought that up was because Joan in the Dreamer world is a dreamer. She, like Maya and like everyone else of her species, has the ability to change the fabric of reality with her thoughts. If she thinks it, she can do it. But they have been terrorized ever since the beginning, ever since they first landed in sort of the universe, which that has more expositional things involved with it, with the cosmology of the world and everything there. Ever since dreamers have first begun to exist, they have been hunted and killed and had their power and their souls taken by this entity called the Dream Daemon. And the Dream Daemon, we don't know why he does it, but we know he does it, and that's not good, because, people are literally dying. And this has been a thing ever since the beginning of time. They've been fighting and fighting, and they've been warring, and all the other species have been involved. They've been involved since the beginning and everything. And it's just been ultimately not good. And Joan is someone who gets really, really fed up with it. And something special about Joan is that Joan is one of the 3 dreamers of her universe, because every other universe has it, that weaves the collective fate of just the people in that universe And as a result of that, she gets access to this really super powerful special journal-sized book called The True Chronicles that essentially, it functions as a gateway to another sort of like plane of existence. And in that plane of existence is this sort of like super powerful, super strong, super durable, like omniversal, like highest of the high plane, like metal from the highest of planes. And there's also like power that comes from it and all that. So Joan just kind of takes that and uses her connection to it to sort of like make and forge and essentially build the true dreamer on her own to try and take down the daemon. Now it doesn't like fully happen, but she is able to take him down and stop him, and essentially stop him from coming down and invading more so than he would. Joan was able to act as a layer of protection against the daemon. And I know anyone who knows Joan is gonna look at that and go, that's kind of odd, considering Joan never actually like fought. She just kind of like whipped all the boys into shape to be like, hey, we have work to do. But honestly, I couldn't really see another way of doing Joan. I could have like sort of had it where she had like been a mentor to others, but I feel like ultimately that would have had to have happened with her starting the line, and then she ends up training her granddaughter when her granddaughter is sort of like older and everything. When her granddaughter sort of like has her power and she gets born with it, and the line continues downward, and the true dreamer gene skips a generation until it gets to Maya. So it's just kind of something that I feel like would be ultimately pretty okay for like one of the most famous women who've been involved in wars, really, that we know of anyway.
Yeah, and it's like your prerogative if you're creating an alternate history to kind of deviate from that. And it's cool because we were talking about personal agency, and women back then didn't exactly have, you know, the sort of freedoms that we would want to have, and currently still struggling for that. So it's cool to kind of see an alternate history that imagines what she might have done if she lived in a fantasy world and still like was herself in terms of like, you know, having that fighting spirit and the courage to do something. So yeah, I think that's really cool that you kind of weaved basically her personality into your own fantasy work instead of just staying with the history of it.
And speaking on sort of like women's rights and everything in the Dreamer world, this is something that I point out in basically everything I do with Dreamer. We don't have like homophobia and sexism and racism and all of that stuff. That just doesn't exist in the Dreamer world. And part of it, one of the main ways that you can sort of like see it in Dreamer is in the amount of women characters,
right?
Which is to say, all of them.
I noticed it was like, oh, okay, a beautiful cast of like female characters, which is pretty cool. I also write almost exclusively female characters, and then it's like supporting male characters.
There are only three. There are only three guys that really appear like on screen in Dreamer, in the first book anyway. And this is going to be a trend that continues on with the series. But in Dreamer, all the positions of power are essentially held by women. There's Agent Michaela Morrigan, well, I mean, well, one is held by women, two is held by queer women of color. There's Agent Michaela Morgan, who is one of the special agents in the Power Management Agency, which is a new branch of the, well, not a new branch, but it's a branch of the United States government that deals specifically with powered people. So it functions somewhat like the FBI, but not quite. And Morgan is also the liaison for the True Dreamer, because the True Dreamer is a free agent because she, doesn't belong to the government. She is her own person. She is independent. But because she saves the world and everything, she kind of has to be involved with these people. There's Rosemary Vinson, who is Maya's best friend, a lesbian, who leads just a whole battalion of angels in essentially heaven. And she is just amazing, and we love her, and she's great, and you will see a lot of her in the book. She's been like everyone's favorite character. And then of course there is Maya and Joan of Arc, who are the beginners and the descendants of a very strong matrilineal line that has just been in the public eye for over half a century. They've been in the public eye. The savior of the world, of everything, has been a woman. So if that doesn't get rid of sexism, I don't know what will. and granted, for the German world, there just hasn't been sexism or racism. I mean, granted, it's been there because we sadly do so have an America and a Disney. So the vestiges of sort of like of colonialism and all that stuff is still there, but it's not a focus for the story. And the story, you could, I suppose, make an argument that it doesn't really exist in the world. Again, it doesn't exist, but the vestiges of it are there. But the Dreamer world is supposed to be ahead of our own, even if it takes place in 2018. So it falls into a weird limbo-ish area. But the reason that that's a thing, the reason that there is none of that stuff, none of the bad societal ills, is because I'm tired of seeing them, honestly. I am Black, I am bisexual, I am disabled, hard of hearing. And I fit me, and literally all of my friends are girls. I've grown up around girls my entire life. My mom raised me and my sisters single-handedly. I'm the youngest in a family of all girls. I've just grown up around women, and that's just been natural for me. And I'm just tired of sort of like seeing just oppression be the only way in which traditional media says that we can exist. We are more than our trauma, and Dreamer is my extension of that. It's an extension of that just fundamental belief that I hold, and I don't work it into any of my stories except like a very, very tiny thing that you can just skip over. If that, because it doesn't need to be there. It doesn't need to exist in this world. It doesn't need to exist in these worlds. So we don't have systems of oppression. We don't have this stuff because, yeah, it's a major part of our lives, but it's not our lives. We can still live and breathe and have goals and emotions outside of anger and aggression, which is why I do what I do.
Yeah, especially that last line that really strikes like a chord. I think that for me especially, and Shalini, I think, can speak about this too, like I think for me, when I'm writing my book, it's a very self-reflective exercise, even when I don't really think it is. And I realize that some of the ways that I describe my characters or the things that they say are the things that I want to happen in order to progress the plot. I see a lot that mirrors things that I've experienced or things or people close to me have. And I think as well, like that, it's such a beautiful kind of thought, right? Like the idea that there can be a plane where systems of oppression don't exist and like categorization of human beings and prejudice. And it's like almost like you're doing a thought experiment, except it's like in an artistic kind of way, and you're putting a narrative to it. And I think that a lot of folks have trouble understanding a lot of these kinds of concepts, especially when they bring up like uncomfortable realities of our world or like painful histories. I'm a huge history nerd too, Ja-Mel, and I did my undergrad in political science and history, the combined one. And it was definitely really hard at times to read how much of history is characterized by suffering and people like just trying to conquer or take over each other. And I thought very deeply about, like, philosophically, like, where does this stuff come from? Like why do we feel the need to do this? Why are we so afraid of people in different parts of the world, or even people that are close to us but have different traditions or whatnot? Like, what is it about these things that just makes us like want to combat one another or see each other as different, when really like we have so many things in common? Too many things in common for us to actually like continue to be like this forever, hopefully. Yeah, do you have some more?
Do I have thoughts?
There's so many things that are there, but yeah. Maybe you have a bit more to say.
For sure. I think that's, I totally agree with what you said, Ja-Mel, and I read your blog post about hashtag own voices, and that was, it resonated quite a lot with me too. I thought it was a great blog post that you wrote. And I think that's always kind of been my main gripe with like dark fantasy or some more grim dark or more quote unquote realistic fantasies, is that they constantly have to bring it back to this like situation of oppression for a particular group. And you know, in a fantastical world that can still happen, like conflict and like oppressive systems, etc., can still happen, and that's a core of conflict. But like, for example, with Game of Thrones, it's like a lot of people have iterated. I know.
The sigh says it all.
I have so many words on Game of Thrones, but we will talk about that after you finish your saying.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have thought about this too, especially after season 5, when we saw the sexual assault of a main female character that didn't happen in the book. And it just like, kind of came out of nowhere. Apparently it was a focus group, and people thought that this would be great for her character development instead of going with the Sansa thing. And guess who was the main demographic? it was not young girls, let's say. So,
yeah. Oh boy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It just
like, yeah. Anyway, so that's a whole thing. But anyway, the whole idea of fantasy and the fact that we can have dragons and magic and all these things, but still have like women who are oppressed and who have lesser agency. Like, I understand that there has to be a certain realism to like medieval fantasy, for example, but
that doesn't have to, like here's the thing. You can have dragons and gods, which that's a whole other conversation. You could have dragons and gods and freaking ice zombies. And yet, for everything that you're adding in, you decide to keep the racism and the sexism and the homophobia and everything. And it's ultimately just the fetishization of trauma. And where does this come from? This comes ultimately from places of privilege, and this is gonna be a whole conversation. It's gonna spiral into a whole thing. But essentially, let's take Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones is really the quintessential core of it. Well, not the core of it, because it didn't begin it at all, but it's the core of it now, anyways. The rampant sexism and brutality against women, the coding and the racism that is in the books in the books and the TV show through the coding of more barbaric and uncivilized and villainous people as dark, and the heroes being white, and all this and all that. That all comes from just ultimately places of privilege. It's the reason that people can see it as good for a character is because they don't live it. If they lived it, they would know the pain of it. And if they wanted to do it, which not saying they don't have to, because I talk about that in the post, saying that, depicting the stuff is valid. But if they lived it, they would depict it with the care and the sensitivity that it deserves.
Yeah.
But if you come from a place of privilege, you don't do that. You don't. And that's ultimately why I kept that stuff out, because people say, oh, if it's a fantasy, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do that. And for Dreamer, so I don't think I actually mentioned this, but not this version of Dreamer I have in my hand, but the version of Dreamer that's available on Amazon right now is my second edition of the book. The first edition was released in March of last year, in March 2019. And I took that one down at around the beginning of April. But some of the one-star reviews, quite a couple of the one-star reviews, pointed out and just questioned, why hasn't the Dreamers, if they have this massive amount of power, subjugated and done all this stuff to everyone else? And I haven't answered it because I don't care to. I mean, not I don't care to, but it just doesn't exist because they don't have to. Oppression isn't a plot point.
Mm.
2, we don't have to have oppression. We can still make and create amazing stories outside of that. And granted, there is problems between the species and everything, but that is all background stuff that's just mentioned in one paragraph in exposition, and then it goes away.
Right.
So it's not a thing because I don't want it to be a thing. You can make other conflicts. Oppression isn't the only way to garner sympathy or show that someone is evil or show that someone can be human.
Yeah.
There are so many other ways to do it. It's just basic empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people in places of privilege lack that with regards to their privilege. And it's a whole...
Right. I think, it's super interesting to bring this up, but oh no, now I had a brain freeze. What was I going to say?
Take your time.
Oppression. Right. The idea that power equals subjugation or a will to dominate immediately. The idea of does absolute power absolutely corrupt someone? That the answer doesn't always have to be yes. And I think it's more creative to try and see something outside of what we've already seen in history, and to kind of imagine other ways of power existing that are not just Western sensibilities of the idea of power, where it's literally just oh, if you have more power, then you can lord it over other people, essentially. and that continuously happens in the world we live in. And unfortunately, it's kind of the reality and why people want to like keep climbing up. So it's really nice to hear that there's, powerful beings that don't use that power to subjugate others, because that's an interesting, again, alternative history almost to what we currently experience. And something that I always think about is, how escapist is fantasy for different people. For some people, it might not be, like, especially like Game of Thrones, like you can't escape the sexism there. It's like, okay, you can escape this like mundane reality that we have, but you can never like...
Your escapism only goes to a certain layer.
Yes. And that again is to the fetishization of those discriminatory acts, which, George R. R. Martin, he's a pacifist. I'm sure he's like well-intentioned and everything. He's a historicist as well, so he likes talking about history through his books. But as you said, like it's from a point of privilege to include some reality and not other realities. So I'm always considering like what does fantasy mean to different people, and how has like fantasy privileged certain groups' ideas of escapism and not other people, and what does that say about the demographic of people who read and write fantasy? Who are the people who actually pick it up and see themselves reflected in the stories and things like that.
And speaking on that, all of my characters were originally white. They are not white anymore, but that's because I had to be awakened to the fact that all of my characters are white. Maya's full name is Maya Juanita Isadora Hernandez Lilac. And I know that if there are any Latinx readers and viewers, they're already cringing because they're like, why is Lilac at the end of the name when it's at the end of the last name when it should be at the beginning? But matrilineal world, the mother has the most power. That's why. Moving on, there's Maya, who is mixed. She's her dad's Honduran and her mom is Dutch. There's Rosemary, who's mixed Black American, Black Greek. There is Morgan, who is Black. There's Shelby, who's Filipina. Filipino mom and Swedish dad, and like there's all of that. There's racial differences in the book, but that doesn't translate to a difference of how they're treated, how they're expressed, how they're dealt with regards to their race or their sexuality or anything like that. Granted, they have different levels of power within the world, but that comes from the world itself and not from any things from our world that I'm bringing into it. And I didn't know that my characters were white all of my characters are white up until I was 14. And from there, I just wanted to take and change it because I realized from that point forward that I didn't really see myself represented in really any media. And fantasy is my favorite genre of genres. And I could never see myself. And it's different now. Like I have a bunch of books now with people of color in them. We have A Blade So Black, which this is amazing. City of Brass, Children of Blood and Bone.
Oh, yeah.
We have the Bone.
Yeah.
We have the Bone Witch, and we have a bunch of other books. A bunch of other books by POC, by people of color, and by also queer people of color. And queer disabled people of color, because we can have a trillion different intersections. Mm-hmm. I am living proof of this, but that's another thing. And I've just wanted to see myself and see other people. I've wanted to see myself represented in books. I've wanted other people to see themselves represented in books. Being able to see myself just makes me so happy and so overjoyed, and I want to give that to other people, and that's why I write. And that was one of the things that I've really, really loved about like people when they've responded to Dreamer, and when they've said, oh my God, this is such like a quintessentially like Latinx thing. And I'm like, yes, I did my job. Which I had a sensitivity reader help me with. I had someone that I talked to, and I was like, hey, can you help me with this? And she had like told me about like, hey, stuff in Honduras, and I had taken and translated as much of it into the book as I could, because Maya could be functionally Honduran, because she can just teleport there and she can stay there for as long as she wants, really. But that's just kind of like a thing that's there, that exists in the world. And this, like, I wanted to show other people's cultures. I wanted them to see themselves and not feel like they were being forgotten, not feel like they weren't being seen in fantasy, which is why, like, I wanted to give them an escape. I wanted my book to be an escape that isn't, or that rather in the past and still kind of isn't, but a little bit more now, well, a little less so now, isn't really represented by mass media.
For sure.
I wanted it to be an escape, and for it to be an escape, we can't have that. We can't have like all the isms there.
Indeed. Yeah. I was going to say that as authors, we also strive to do that as well. Obviously, person of color. We're both bisexual as well, so we try to...
Yay! Bye.
Bye, Brad!
Virtual.
So you can speak to this especially because, I mean, bi people are not represented well in media. Like, it's always, again, like the whole thing, like, bi people are like, you know, treacherous, or they deceive you somehow.
Oh my God, the amount of, don't even get me started on that.
You want to talk about your...
Yeah, like, yeah, sure, a little bit.
You also, like, explore biness in
some
of your main characters.
Yeah, so my main character is a bi man, and he is in a kind of semi-nomadic society. They would be considered like his whole society would be considered kind of ethnically ambiguous in today's world, and for him, he's bi, but so his role in society is to be a guardian of like the camp, not like a military person necessarily, but someone who just stands guard and keeps watch, kind of thing. And that role is only reserved for men who are gay. The thing is, the character, he is not 100% like homosexual or like exclusively into men. He's into women as well. And I have that set up because that was prompted by this video that I watched. There was an evolutionary biologist named Richard Dawkins. And he's pretty famous. Apparently he invented the concept of memes, like literally. And
yes,
he was talking about how there's a theory about how the gay gene was preserved. So I guess like whatever genetic variation that like makes people come out as like they're born queer. And he said that it could be that heterosexual males, and this is like in primeval times, like prehistory, would be the ones to go out and hunt or like take part in combat and like really dangerous stuff, and they leave men who are like, you know, more effeminate or just don't present in a way that is very strong and masculine to guard the camp. and it's, you know, and I'll use some profanity here. It's nicknamed the sneaky fucker theory, which I kind of love.
Oh God.
Because the idea is that those men who are behind guarding the camp with like women and children, etc., and like not doing the ultra dangerous manly stuff, would then sleep with like the wives and girlfriends of the dude bros who are out. And I just thought that it's such a, there's no way we'll ever, I think, be able to confirm it, but it was such an interesting, like, biological theorem or kind of explanation for how queerness came about in human societies, or why it exists. And so I wanted to base my characters, his person, on that kind of concept, and like, how would this person like exist if they are not 100% homosexual, and their chosen role, and like in a very spiritual way, is to just stand and to guard things. I don't think I'm doing it justice, but like it raises a ton of questions about like how we see queer people today, and indeed in both in United States and Canada, there's a stereotype that a lot of gay men enter the military. And indeed, I'm sure like there's tons of people in the military that are LGBT plus, and like that's coming out more and more, that folks are joining and are being accepted. And I wonder, like, why did that stereotype exist? Is it because it's like in the military traditionally is a largely male environment? Like, why do we have these assumptions about people who, you know, who are defending our societies or whatnot?
Yeah. What I find interesting about that, like your rendition of that story, is there's already an accepted idea for homosexual people in a fantasy book.
And it's not necessarily like they're not judged to be lesser, like necessarily. It's meant to kind of mirror how we think about, like, we as I guess just a society, you know, global society, people think of queer people. But again, I wanted to explore if they have a role that's formalized and is a part, I don't know, maybe you can just take it away.
Part of society. Like, I mean, that's part of indigenous
and not deviant
cultures as well. Yeah, like having roles that are considered like equal, if not more important in society, that is considered with your gender or how you identify, or your sexual orientation, etc. So the reason why I asked you to bring it up was I thought that was a really cool part of your book that also related to what we were talking about.
I've had the thought of, you know, do I want to include characters that are like trans, for example, and I'm not trans, and I was like, you know, but how much could I honestly represent this kind of character, and it's not kind of like a token or like a kind of like a hacky representation that is just there to kind of satisfy what I think people would like to see instead of what I think is authentic.
There was something that you brought up before, Morgan, about how you were really unsure of how to depict sort of like trans characters, yeah? And so this isn't in Dreamer, but it'll be like sort of like in the sequels, and well, in the next couple books in the series, as well as in my current story, Champions, in which one of the characters, Leica, is trans, AFAB, assigned female at birth, trans man, and a couple of other are gender queer, where I am not. I am a cis male. And this also applies to Maya as well, because, well, I'm not Latina. I'm Black. I'm not Latina. I can relate on the bi front, but not on the Latina front. I asked, I just like went to Twitter. I was like, hey, do you know anyone who can like help do you know anyone who's cis that can help me out with like something for like a character that I'm trying to make in my story? And from there I was able to sort of like get a reply, and I was able to reach out to someone, and from there I was able to sort of get it, like I was able to do it really. And there's a difference between sort of like, because like you can have any kind of character in your story regardless of their, and I hate this word, but I'll say it, marginalization. You can have them in the world and in the story and as characters and even as main characters, because again, I am not Latina, but Maya is. But you know, of course, like, you know, do your research and talk to people who live that experience to try and make it as authentic as you can, while also not trying to tell the story and not trying to tell their story and tell the story of like how they themselves are oppressed and how they deal with some of the more sensitive aspects of their lives. And of course, like, you know, having sensitivity readers who are of that group, and you know, listening to them and always deferring to them and always defaulting on everything they say, and just all of that stuff. But that I just kind of want to respond to that, because I know that it's a thing that writers always struggle with, and I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I have done a lot of work with it, not just in regards to sexuality and ability, well, not just with regards to sexuality and race, but also with regards to ability and body size. Champions, in Champions, all of the main characters are plus sized, and some of the other characters are, and a fair amount of the other characters in the book are also plus size, and they all have different body shapes and different body sizes, all within the plus size range. And I spent like a while trying to find a good way to describe them and trying to find a respectful way to describe them. And I went to some of my friends who were plus size and were like, hey, how's this, how's this, how's this, how's this? And they said, this is good, this is good, this is good, this is good. And then from there, I was able to sort of like feel a bit more confident in me doing what I do with it. But even with all of that stuff, for every single book I do that has plus size characters, which all of them will now, I'm going to go to those people for help, because you can do it right one time, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll do it right the next time. So it's a process of always learning and always trying to sort of like just do your best. And I just kind of wanted to comment on that, because I know it's a thing that a lot of people struggle with. And I don't know, I feel maybe what I'm saying can sort of like help and resonate with some people.
Yeah, I think that's great advice too. I've kind of been thinking about how to co-create characters that you have imagined, but then you can, you know, get a beta reader or someone who you know in your circle who identifies as that person if you don't yourself, and how you can co-create a character with that person. So in my own book, I have someone who is Mauritian, from Mauritius, and I have a friend who's from Mauritius. So I haven't done this yet, but I want to bring her into a conversation to co-create that character with her, to kind of understand, like, okay, this is the person that he is, but can you kind of help me fill in the blanks of, like, you know, I've never been to Mauritius, and how does that culture function, and how can a person arise from such a culture, and how has it shaped their personality, kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's really great work that you've done, to be so considerate of the different diversity that you have, and to bring people in to create the book and the story that you wanted to create. Because I think ultimately, like, we always say that writing is a solitary act, but I think when it comes to like building characters. I don't think it necessarily has to be. Like,
writing is far from solitary, and I actually point that out in the acknowledgments of Dreamer. The acknowledgments of Dreamer begins with me saying, even though, well, the first paragraph ends with me saying, even though my name's on the cover and there's 2 people who edited it and there's 1 person who designed the cover, this book has spanned many, many, many more people than just us 4. And then I just go into thanking everyone for what they did and how they helped and, you know, the way that they did stuff and the way that they influenced the book.
Yeah, I think that's super important. So that's great advice. I think we will start wrapping it up. So we ask a question for every author, basically, that we interview at the end. It's kind of a ritualistic send-off. But so the question is, what do you think the function of fantasy literature is in society, and how do you see yourself and your work contributing to it? So I think this whole discussion of diversity and bringing characters in has kind of been touching on that, but if you can succinctly summarize that for us.
The function of fantasy in literature and fantasy literature in society is to serve as an escape, is to be the place where creativity and imagination can be the most unfettered, and where you can create the worlds that you want to see and explore those worlds. And I believe me and my stories are greatly contributing to that and contributing to the future by showing people like us, by showing just people like us who are either vilified by the dominant culture of society, which is cis, which is white, cishet, allosexual, etc. And showing us as people who can live lives beyond our everyday. I feel like my books and my stories and everything are escapism. And that is ultimately what I feel it should be, an escape that leans and aspires to the future in terms of our hopes and our dreams and our goals, even if we have completely fantastical elements that make no sense and that don't gel with the real world and that fly in the face of what we know as reality. Because isn't that what fantasy is supposed to be?
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah, I mean, that was incredible. And yeah, I think, Ja-Mel, like, this has been one of the most, again, like, reflective interviews that we've really done. And I get the impression that a lot of the creative sensibilities that we have are very similar, and you know, we're not doing this just to entertain people. Like, we want to communicate our feelings and ideas, and I like what you said about how we want to create worlds and these realities in which people who, like you said, are like us, exist and aren't in the same condition that we are here. And I think that that's kind of the whole thing. It's underpinned by idealism as well as a recognition of like what the real world is like for a lot of people. And yeah, I think you've reinvigorated my sense that fantasy is a hopeful thing in general, that writing is a hopeful thing, and that it's really all about dialogue and sharing. And yeah, like, I want to thank you for like very much for sharing those things that are very close to you, and like being frank about like how you feel about stuff. as well as Shalini, and I'm happy as well I was able to share it, and this was a really cool experience. So
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me on. I was happy to sit and talk for like an hour and a half. Just about everything, really. And we didn't talk too much. Well, we talked about Dreamer a bit, but the conversation drifted away from that.
And that's the beauty of this medium, is like it can go in any direction.
Dreamer, you can find Dreamer on Amazon. I'll send you guys a link to the book there. You can also just buy it directly from my website, where you can also buy it directly from my website, where you can view the preview, which will also be down in the description, or wherever this is posted. Sorry, I say description because my brain is like, YouTube!
Yes, down below, yeah.
Yes, down below in the description. But yeah, Dreamer, a science fantasy that is essentially a magical girl anime like Sailor Moon, replete with all the powers and all the high power and all the high skill that all of that implies, and all of the amazing comic book stuff without, like, all the awfulness of it, because there's a lot, and there's a lot, so much of everything. Even though I love it, it is a pain sometimes. But you can find Dreamer on Amazon. Right now, the ebook is the only one that's available, but I will be getting I'm currently working on trying to get the paperback up and ready to go. I'm just having some trouble with the cover and Amazon. I can be found on Twitter at Maya the Dreamer, Facebook at Author J Vinson, and I think that's about it for me.
Awesome. Great.
Awesome.
So yes, links down below.
Links will be down below, and as always, we'd like to thank you, Ja-Mel, our author, for coming on and for sharing your
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you.
Check out the description of this video and you can see the different platforms we put our content on, as well as our social media links. Thanks again and see you next time.